We've seen Tom Muley before. In fact, if you Google administrative records, you might see his face there showing up. Algorithms for including administrative data to address non-response follow-up efforts. Tom?
Thank you, Tommy. I thank the committee for asking us to do this presentation, and on behalf of the Administrative Records Modeling team, happy to share the approaches and some of the results that we have been doing. There probably with the algorithms, I could probably spend 20 minutes talking about our algorithms, and then also with some of the research results that we end up having, I could probably end up talking about 20 minutes for that as well. So I tried to put together a combination of those with trying to take into account Barbara's guidance of trying to make it short as possible. So we'll go over some of the things, but definitely as going through, you can definitely go back during the committee discussion if there's other parts, or also with providing with the background paper, any material which was put in there, we can also discuss as well. As Lisa did mention, as part of the April 21st June PM, or the PMR, there will be a session on there, which Andy Keller of my team and Marianne Chapin will be doing. I will be canvassing Disney World, so unfortunately I won't be able to be there that day, but I leave it in Andy's capable hands. So we'll go over some of the things, especially with our 2016 census test, and also seeing with what, at the end, trying to get through we'll go over our modeling, but also with our modeling, what things are we changing with our 2018, and also in regards to our contact strategy. So getting into it with our 2016 contact strategy, this is what we ended up doing for our non-response follow-up housing units. So these addresses had already been contacted up to 5 times based on the self-response mailings, which happened in March and through up past Census Day. So once we got to our non-response follow-up operations, we ended up saying the addresses that we were able to identify as administrative records vacant, those cases, and also our deleted cases, for those, we did not do any field work, and we'll go into the algorithms which we are proposing for those a little bit later. But for those cases, they got no field work. We were taking advantage of the United States Postal Service and the footwork and the results that those carriers were able to give us based on their determining of the undeliverable address NICSI codes. But for those cases, when the 2016 census test, one thing which we ended up doing is during the start of the non-response follow-up period in the middle of May, we sent a postcard to those addresses. So this was given them based on that postcard. While we told them, while a enumerator may not come visit you, you still have the opportunity to respond. So they did have this self-response option before we ended up using our administrative record vacant or non-existent determinations. For the remaining cases, they proceeded to go along the bottom part of the flow chart. Every remaining case received at least 1 visit. So with that 1 visit, a case could be resolved. It could complete the enumeration with the interviewer at the doorstep. The interviewer could determine, hey, this address is vacant. Also, in the course of doing this, we left a notice of visit. The person could get home, they could pull the notice of visit off and say, oh, I need to respond. They could go online, go to the internet, fill it out that way. They could get out their paper questionnaire. Or we also had the 800 number, so they could do the TQA account resolution. They could dial the phone number and complete the census that way. So they had those are the multiple ways it could be resolved on the first case. For our administrative records occupied cases, after that 1 determination, we ended up stopping. So we ended up looking to be able to see, could we use that information? While we did not send any more field work after that 1, we proceeded about a week later for those administrative record cases, we sent them another postcard mailing. So they got that postcard mailing another week later, letting them know that they still had the opportunities to respond. So that's kind of one of the things we were able to do in the 2016 census test related to our administrative record vacant and delete cases, and then also our occupied cases. For the remaining cases, they received the full contact strategy, which was 6 visits with starting proxy on the 3rd. So with little details of what our algorithms for determining our administrative record cases, we'll start off with our vacancy determination. So with our administrative record vacancy determination, we'll go over some of the data sources which we are using. So our main sources of which we're able to utilize is information from the United States Postal Service. And the main point that which we're able to utilize, and seen in our research, is taking advantage that when we mail our questionnaires, when we mail the letters and the postcards and the questionnaires, is requesting the undeliverable as address service from the post office, but also requesting that they give us the NICSI reasons for why they could not deliver. Some examples of those are vacant, you have no such number or no such street. There's about 11 of those codes, and we've done research to see how do those codes correspond with our outcomes, especially in the 2010 census of occupied, vacant, and delete. We also use information from the delivery sequence file, which has been delivered to us. Is this address classified as residential delivery? We also look to use other sources of information. So from the Internal Revenue Service, we are able to use 1040 tax filings and also 1099 informational returns, your W-2 statements, your informational returns about dividends. We're able to use both of those, and we thank the Internal Revenue Service, because starting in 2015, they started in February of a year providing us monthly deliveries of those. So we were able to have what were the tax filings right before they had been processed by IRS, right before the start of our non-response follow-up operation. We also take into account the Medicare database, the Indian Health Service database, and we also use a third-party source, the Veteran Service Group of Illinois. We use that as also an indication. Can that provide us information about whether people are living at an address? So with on our determining administrative record vacant units, with our housing unit status model, we currently run that on our 2010 census. So we take the addresses that were in the non-response follow-up. There was about just under 50 million of those in 2010. We took a sample of those, and for our dependent outcome, we have the 2010 census status of whether it was occupied, vacant, or delete. So we have a multinomial outcome space, and we proceed to use a series of explanatory variables. So our key variables, which we do end up using, and these are just some examples, the paper, the attachment, has the full list of variables which we are currently using, is the UAA flags and the reasons for the first and the second mailing. So the first mailing had an in-home delivery of about March 23rd. The second delivery had an in-mail delivery around April 1st, and Census Day is April 1st. So we put that in there. With looking at these codes, we did see some inconsistencies as part of our analysis when looking at past tests, looking at the 2015 National Content Test, and also looking back at the 2010 data, was seeing, is there consistency of codes between the first mailing and the second mailing? So based on seeing that, we were able to add in a kappa coefficient, looking at based on having these two codings within a zip code, how often are we seeing agreement of those codings or seeing differences? So that was another covariate which we were able to add into this test. We also add in indicators, can we find on the IRS 1040s, 1099s, the Medicare database, our third-party source, can we find indications of finding people at those addresses? Because we've seen this has been powerful covariates of indicating these addresses may be occupied. And we also take into account information from our American Community Survey. We are able to take advantage of block group level estimates of what's the percentages of renters, poverty, percent black, percent vacant. So we're able to take a lot of information that we have about the local area we're trying to make a determination on. So with going through, we have run this model. We run on our 2010. So in 2016, we proceed to make a prediction. We want to make a prediction. So we have our information. So we have a probability of an address being vacant, who we can predict, and a probability of the address being occupied. So for our 2016 census test, we moved over to using a Euclidean distance approach. Since we have those two probabilities, we want the probability of vacant to be as close to 1 as possible. We want that probability of occupied to be as close to 0 as possible. So based on those, what's the Euclidean distance of how far are we away from that particular point? So the next slide is a graphical explanation, a graphical picture of this. So based on this, we're able to do a series of, and this is just 1 percentile bands based on our 20% data, is how close to the top or up left corner are we where we have a probability of vacant being 1 and a probability of occupied being 0. So we can proceed to calculate the Euclidean distance as far away from there, and we can, since we have this continuous measure, we can make a cutoff about which cases might we want to reduce field work, whereas which cases we might want to doing our full contact strategy. So in this example A, if I do have that example threshold, housing unit A, we would reduce the, we determine that to be administrative records vacant. We would reduce we would not do any field work for those cases, but basically the address number B with having a only 40% probability of being vacant and about a 20% probability of being occupied, and that's a case which we want to go out and do field work. So that was our explanation of our vacant model. And the one thing I will mention, if our non-existent model, we did a similar thing. We had our multinomial outcome space where we wanted the third probability, which we were predicting, was the probability of being non-existent, of being a delete. So for that model, we did a similar thing where we just replaced the vacant probability with the non-existent probability and used that to make a similar determination. So what did we end up doing on our occupied side? So we need to identify administrative record occupied units. So our main question for our NERFU project is, can we reduce the contacts for 101 Main Street? So the steps to which we end up doing is we proceed to build a roster from the administrative record sources. So we'll go a little bit over that. One thing which we're going to do is that we're going to be able to look and check to see, are there multiple sources besides just one agency that indicates that a family lives at an address? Then after doing that, then we will proceed to use statistical models to evaluate the roster. And then based on that, we need to make a decision for 101 Main Street. Are we reducing contacts or are we doing the full contact strategy? So the models which I'm going to be going over are pretty much looking to answer these two questions. So one is, how likely is it that we are counting all of the people that we have rostered from the administrative records in the right place? So the person place model, which I'm going to go over, provides information about how we do that. We've also researched a second model with our household composition model, which is how likely is it that the household composition that we are observing based on the administrative records, which based on the number of adults we are seeing and the presence of children or not, how did that compare to what the census got for those similar compositions? And so we were able to develop the model for that. With having these two models and we were researching them, when we end up learning going up to the 2016 census test, is that using both of these together, we were able to make a better determination than using only one or the other. So we'll also go a little bit over with some of the data sources which we are using. Again, with building our rosters, we are taking from the Internal Revenue Service. We are taking what are the current filings from the 1040 tax returns. And as I did mention, the processing which we did do, we did get a delivery in early May, which accounted for all the processing that they were able to do of anybody who filed their taxes on April 15th, that they were able to process before they delivered to us in early May. We also had the 1099 informational returns, W-2s, we included those people as well. And we also included people that we found on the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, the Medicare enrollment database. And we also included people we found on the Indian Health Service patient database. We proceeded to make a roster for those people, and then we proceeded to use additional sources to get us some more information about those. So the Social Security, from looking at the Numiden file, we are able to obtain age and sex for those people. For working with our friends in CARA, we were able to take advantage of research that they were able to do, assigning what's the best race and Hispanic origin, research that they were able to do of assigning based on 2010 responses, and then also information that they have from other federal sources and other processing what they were able to do to assign a race and Hispanic origin to a person. We also take into account the United States Postal Service information about UAA, and then we also use the VSGI, the third-party file. We also use that. We're not rostering people from this, but we are using that as indications of, are we finding those people at that same address? Can it provide some corroboration? We are continuing to research additional sources, so we are going along, and so we are looking at SNAP data. We are pursuing that, trying to see how that implications are. Also, we mentioned with the CARA, we are looking at a KidLink file, which we did document in the paper, with taking advantage of Social Security applications and data that we get delivered to the Census Bureau. We have the Social Security, which we can encrypt and put into the PICs for the children. But for the mothers and the fathers, we don't have their Social Security numbers, but we do have their name information. And our friends in CARA were able to take that information and we will see, can we have a file where we can link the children with the mothers or the fathers that we have on the Social Security? So that's another one which we are exploring. And we will continue to explore these through September of 2018. So we had the two questions, and so the two models which we end up saying, so how are we assessing if we're counting all the people that we rostered in the right place? So we've been doing research on what we call our person-place model. So it's a binary logistic regression model. So we're kind of looking at person-place combinations for the administrative record sources. So we took our 2010 census NRFU, the 50 million addresses. We took a sample of those. And so we were able to say, for those sample of addresses, we're also able to look for the administrative records and what rosters could we build for those using 2010 data. So our dependent variable is that was that administrative record person that we've rostered, can we find that person in the 2010 census? And this is done based on the protected identification keys that have been assigned to the administrative record files and we've had assigned to our census. If also 0 if it's not able to. So we proceed to model that using a series of variables. So our independent variables are, could we find that person on a 1040 return at that 101 Main Street? Did we find them on an informational return, 1099 at 101 Main Street? So we can take those based on the sources. We also look to say, okay, is the source indicating that you might also be at 5 Broad Street? So we said a whole series of covariates that said, hey, we've found you at another address. We also take into account those ACS covariates that I mentioned earlier. And so based on this, we're able to get the model parameters from the 2010 run. And then based on our 2016 data, for example, we can apply those beta coefficients to our new data. So every single person that we've now rostered for our 2016 test, we can say, what was our probability that we have that they were observed in the 2010 census at this address? So we do have these for all the persons that we rostered, but we need to make a decision at the housing unit level. So based on our research, we take the minimum of the person probability that we ended up assigning. So if the 4 people, we'll take the smallest of the 4, and we end up using that. And in our research, we've seen using the minimum is kind of most correlated with count agreement. So we've used this for our person place. We also take into account the other model, which I was talking about, is how is the household composition that we observed in administrative records, how did that compared when we actually did the 2010 census? So we have our training data from 2010. Our dependent variable are these 7 categories of combinations of the number of adults that we're seeing based on 18 or older and whether children are present or not. So we're able to classify our census dependent variables for this. And based on our administrative records, we are able also to classify the administrative records as well. So then our independent variables is that AR household composition. So what's our probability of observing this census composition given that we have this administrative records composition and other information? So the other information we have, what's the administrative record count that we have, what's the UAA information, and the indicators and the ACS covariates, which I mentioned earlier. Again, we get the model code, we have the beta parameters, and we can proceed to apply those to our 2016 data, and then we can have a predicted probability given that we have a certain combination, we may have 2 adults with no kids, what's the probability the census had that category? So again, we have these 2 models. We have these 2 prediction probabilities, which we have at the housing unit level. Now we need to make a decision. So this is another case where we've changed from 2015, where we moved to our Euclidean distance. We were using a linear optimization approach in 2015. But again, with our Euclidean distance, for both of those probabilities that I mentioned, we want those to be as close to 1 as possible. So again, we calculate what's the Euclidean distance or how far from that ideal 1 probability for each one of those that we are. And so again, here's a graphical picture of that, which showing that ideal, we want to be in the top right corner. So how far are we away from that? So this is an example with our 2010 data of 1 percentile bands. We're going further and further away. So based on this scenario, housing unit number A, that one we would decide to reduce contacts if we had that example threshold, where with address B, with having those properties, we said for that address, we need to do our full enumeration. So now this is the Barbara slide. So Barbara had asked in the morning about characteristics. So I'm going to go over some of the characteristics which we're using for our administrative records enumerations, but some of the things which I'm talking about here could also apply to our edit and imputation, and this may be something to talk about at a future CSAC meeting. But what are some of the areas which since we're using administrative records and we're not necessarily conducting interviews, how are we going to get characteristics? So let's share some of the things which we are doing. As mentioned, for age and sex, we were able to look at the census numident and be able to get the age, date of birth, and sex information from there, pretty much almost about 100% of the time. For race and Hispanic origin, we are looking to be working with CARA to be able to see, can we use prior census, American Community Survey, other responses? We are looking to be able to research, the numident does have country of origin information. So we are doing some research of that to say, is that a potential use which can be done? And also using the best race and Hispanic origin research that CARA has done. With doing relationship to the householder, I had mentioned the KidLink file, which we have, which associates mothers and fathers with children. We are researching to see how can that be used to assign relationships to the householder. With tenure, we are looking at several things, including tax and deed information. From third party, they do put that together with what is the tax and deed information for addresses and whether they are owned, and similar with detailed vacancy. So what are some of our results which we ended up seeing in our 2016 census test? So we proceeded to, we had our administrative records determinations. We determined cases being occupied, vacant, or delete. And so for those, we proceeded to take a 1 in 5 sample of those, where we proceeded to ignore our administrative records results and do the full field work for those. So we're going to compare our determinations to what the field work results were. One thing I would like to say, and this kind of applies more for the delete work, is there was no address canvassing which was done ahead of this. So we did apply our results to that universe, but at least with this is one thing which, as the address canvassing fully develops, so how do we need to address our training data for that? So this is the result which we ended up having, and the main highlight which we ended up having was under the occupied column. So for our AR vacants, for those 715 cases which we ended up sending out to the field, 21% of those were occupied. So that was a high result which we ended up seeing and which we wanted to look at a little bit more. But at least with determining vacants, and Sunshine had mentioned earlier, with potential undercoverage for permanent populations, this was a result, and we've seen a similar result in 2015, which we definitely wanted to examine more. Also with the deletes, we thought this address says that this isn't even a housing unit. So there's no issues whether it's occupied or vacant. For those, the field work for those 313, again, 29% of those were coming up as being occupied. So these were two results which we ended up seeing. We just said, okay, let's end up doing some additional analysis. So one thing which we want to look is, what was the Postal Service saying about these vacant and these delete households? So for these, the 151, these are that 21% that were occupied. So the United States Postal Service, the carrier delivering around March 23rd and April 1st, 57% of the time they gave us a vacant code twice. 19% of the time they gave us a vacant code only once. Another 16.6%, we got 2 other codes, and 7.3%, we had only 1 code. So one rule which we did have for 2016 is that for a case to be vacant or delete, you had to have a UAA reason. And these were the results we were seeing from the Postal Service. And this is one thing which we're going to be doing, working with the Postal Service, is that we're having these indications of vacant, but we're having these census fieldworks of occupied. So we are going to try to be, what things can we do with the Postal Service? Because in a modeling framework, this is one of my X covariates. And one of the things you can do as a modeler, how can I take measurement error out of my X covariate? So we're looking to be able to see which things can we do. So if a postal carrier indicates that it is vacant, and how can we be more confident in that? Plus, we're also talking changes to our contact strategy, which address this as well. And it kind of has similar results with the delete cases. So one of the things we had mentioned with the 2016 the 2016 census test is that we were doing the additional mailings. So we had the vacant cases. So one of the things we wanted to do was send them a mailing in May. So for the cases that we did remove, so for the vacants and the deletes, so for the vacants, when we did that mailing in the middle of May, 57% of them were UAA again. So for about 43% of those, the postman delivering about 6 weeks later was able to deliver that postcard. So we did have that. So with that, I mean, people could have moved in between when the postman delivered around April 1st and 6 weeks later. But only 57% of the time we got that UAA result 6 weeks later. The result for the AR deletes, this was a little more stood out to us because around April 1st, there was no such number. They couldn't find it. 6 weeks later, it only came back UAA 75% of the time. We thought this was going to be a lot higher. 25% of the time, looks like they were able to deliver the questionnaire. Now, whether they're delivering it to the right place, something is going on here, which definitely we want to work with the United States Postal Service. But this was someone saying with 25% of these cases being delivered, how might we want to be changing our contact strategy and how we use administrative records, especially for the delete cases? So then what are some of our 2010 analysis, which I do want to share with you, which kind of addresses some of the points which Sunshine brought up this morning related to what was maybe potential socioeconomic impacts. So how does our administrative records determinations with one of the research runs, which we ended up doing using 2010 data, what were the results of that? We're looking at based on the concentration of the Hispanic population in the block group. So each row shows the concentration, starts off at 0 to 10%, all the way down to the bottom where over 50% or more of the population is Hispanic. So as I said, there was just under 50 million addresses in NRFU in 2010. And so the remaining three columns show the row percents. How much of the data did we end up doing this run was vacant, occupied, and doing full contacts. So again, we end up seeing areas that were 0 to 10%, that's where we're doing more of our determinations based on this particular cut of the data. 11.6% of that 31 million was vacant, and 15.9% we determined to be occupied. We're doing full field work for 72.5%. All the way down to areas that were over 50% Hispanic. For those, we're only identifying 4.3% as being vacant, 9.6% as being AR occupied. 86.1% of those are getting the full contact treatment. So then we also looked at the results looking at it a different way. We're looking at based on what was the ACS estimate of the non-Hispanic black population. So again, we end up 0 to 10% is at the top, 50% is at the bottom. And within here, we saw a slightly different result, which again, we wanted to look at and say, okay, maybe we might want to change our strategy. Because here we end up seeing for 0 to 10% for that band of cases, that we ended up identifying 10.5% as vacant, and 16% is occupied, 73% were getting the full contacts. For areas that were 50% or more Hispanic population, for that 4.9 million NRFU households in 2010, we would have identified 12.1% as being administrative records vacant, and 9.6% as being occupied. So the occupied looks like it's going down as the concentration increases, but the vacant determination was 12.1%. So that is an area where there is a large concentration of vacant information. We do have data there. We could make these determinations, but we are concerned about what are the overall results of putting all of this together. We do know from our work, which especially taking into account Art Creasy's work, looking back at the 2010, the 2000, the 1990 censuses, the census tends to underestimate vacancy rate and overestimate occupancies. We end up seeing an undercount of vacant addresses. So we may be on an individual level doing things which are perfectly fine, but at an aggregate level, we are concerned about this. So based on this, we wanted to do some changes to our 2018 contact strategy, which I'd like to share with you today. So again, this is our 2016 strategy, which I went over earlier. And so what things are we doing differently in 2018? So with our proposal for the 2018 is that we will, along the top for administrative records for the vacant and the non-existent addresses, In the middle of May, we will proceed to send that mailing. But we are going to use what is the delivery information, the UAA and the delivery information that we have of that May information. We're going to use that as extra information to determine our field work. If that mailing comes back as UAA again, that 57% of the AR vacants that I showed, the 75% of the deletes, okay, at that point we have a bookend result of postal carrier information. We have UAA statuses around Census Day. We now have UAA statuses from postal fieldwork around May 15th. If those two end up happening, combined with the other administrative record information that we have, we will classify you as vacant or non-existent. So it is one change which we ended up putting in to address some of the concerns we are seeing. If that mailing in May ends up being deliverable, we are going to put that case out into the field work. So we'll get the full field work. It does have the option of self-responding based on the mailing that it got, but this is a change in contact strategy which we are doing for our vacants and our deletes. For our administrative records occupied, we did do a change here. It was along of a similar result. So for our administrative records occupied, we wanted to put in a similar thing that when doing this mailing in May, what happens if we mail out and it comes back as being UAA? The result on the earlier slide, which I didn't mention, that was about 1.5% in 2016. If that does end up happening, we have this little conflict of information. So if it's undeliverable as addressed, let's send those cases out to fieldwork. So this is functionality which we are looking to build into the next census test. So we also did some additional analysis. We've done some training on administrative record using the American Community Survey as training data. We have looked at distances to that Euclidean function, but we also looked at alternatives, but are also interested in hearing other ideas as well. And we're continuing to look at those additional files as well. So I did have these questions, but also at least in the due of time, I can also turn it over to Bob for his discussion.
Okay, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Tom. First, I want to just mention four things. First, this is really important work, and I'll have a slide to highlight that, kind of the big picture. Second, as you might have inferred from going through the presentation here, this is really hard stuff to do. It's really complex. The paper is really complex. It's fantastic work there, but there's a lot to it, and so I give them a lot of credit. They've made a lot of progress on this. This is, again, really important, and the progress you've made is really impressive, and thinking through the changes that you're making and so forth. And fourth, there's still a lot to do. I'm glad we still got time before this rolls out, because there, as Tom highlighted already, there's some further improvements to make. Okay, so a little bit on the importance here. This will reiterate a bit, but this is a really complex presentation set of results. We're talking about 50 million addresses in 2010. Who knows, 50 million or so in 2020 that will fall in the NERFU category. Obviously, the fewer the better, but that's another issue. This is a major new strategy, this is administrative records, and the idea here is to reduce significantly the number of field staff and door knocks. That's what this is all about. It's one of the four key strategies that's outlined in Census 2020 to cut down on costs and produce a high-quality census. So this needs to work. This is, and that's why this is so important. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the key uses of administrative data. First, they want to effectively determine as many vacant, non-existent occupied addresses as possible while minimizing error. And second, to enumerate those households. And so there's kind of two steps in this, and this is what Tom highlighted. Okay, so a little bit, just to, again, this will be a rehash a little bit, but in part this is good for me and hopefully for you all too. Determining the vacant and non-existent addresses in the 2016 test, Okay, so after the mailings and they got them back as undeliverable as addressed, the UAA codes, vacant, no such number, et cetera. So these were eligible to be vacant or non-existent. The administrative records that were used were these codes from the USPS as well as others that Tom highlighted, like from the IRS, the Medicare, and so forth. And then they built person records from the administrative records, assigning them a personal identification number, and trying to figure out, do people seem to be living at these NRFU addresses. Two of these sources, the administrative record sources needed before in-person contacts were reduced. This is a conservative approach. I really like that. I think that's the right way to go. And then they use this multinomial logistic regression model, which is, I think, the right thing to do. They're trying to predict whether these addresses are vacant or non-existent or occupied as the outcome variable, and with all the kind of inputs that they had into this into these models, the USPS info, the individual information from the administrative records, and so forth. And then they use these beta coefficients to obtain predicted probabilities of which addresses are vacant or non-existent, each relative to the occupied. Okay, so then they calculate these distance functions. They're trying to maximize, in the case of vacancies, they're trying to maximize vacancies and minimize occupied, calculate these distance functions. They got a continuous measure for each. And then, you know, there's a cut point drawn there. There's a threshold drawn on those graphs. But, you know, exactly where that threshold is you know, can be debated. And there's kind of sensitivity and specificity to be determined there. I wasn't fully clear on how those thresholds were drawn. I'm sure you could tell us more about that. And then the same thing with the non-existent as well. Okay, and then in determining the occupied addresses, they again used administrative records to develop the household rosters from the IRS 1040s, from the 1099 information returns, from the Medicare database, and the Indian Health Service data. And then he's talked about other potential data from different sources to be finalized by September 2018. This is going to be the really important work, I think, to be done between now and then, is which of these data sources can be acquired, can be put together, can be used, can be effective, and that's got to be done quickly here. I'll get back to this point in a little bit. Okay, further determine the occupied addresses. Tom went through the person-place model and the household composition model. I won't go through those again, but the occupied decision is based on this shortest Euclidean distance between the predicted probabilities of these two inputs. So in other words, I was trying to think through what exactly does this mean. Does administrative record modeling effectively predict all people who live at this address and household composition? And that's the key of what they're trying to do here. Okay, so, and then in assigning characteristics, the Barber slide is, you know, some characteristics are pretty straightforward from the Nubinent file. That's, and then, but there was less work so far done on how some of the other characteristics were going to be enumerated for these administrative records cases. So some of this work is straightforward, and arguably I think this is second order work because I think we have to establish who or which of these addresses fall into which categories first. But for those that are occupied, this needs to be prioritized, I think, in the 2018 test. And I think CSAC would benefit from I should say tables in here and description of results as soon as possible after that 2018 test. Okay. So going back to 2015, there was the test in Maricopa County in 2015 that I don't think you mentioned it here but it was in the paper. This administrative work used an earlier set of methods. Those determined to be occupied in the administrative records, 90% were actually occupied in the field work. So that seemed to be really good. Of the occupied, 60% exactly agreed in terms of the person count and was off by one person, just 26% of the time. But at the same time, those determined to be vacant in the administrative records, 46% only 46% were found to be vacant in the field work. So there was, they're saying, okay, vacant in the administrative records, but there were a lot of these households where people actually lived there, or were they found to be non-existent. So this is problematic. This is something that need to be worked on. So they did in 2016 in Harris County and Los Angeles County. Again, the occupied households turned out to be pretty good. 80% were actually occupied when you did this actual 1 in 5 test. There were some unresolved. I'm not sure what that meant, but I assume that the 80% probably would have gone even higher, closer to the 90 if you did something similar as to 2015. But going down the slide here, a little bit more problematic was that those that were non-existent in the administrative records, there were 29% were actually occupied, and in the vacant, 21% were actually occupied. So there was this mismatch again. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and with adjustments to be made as he talked about. Okay. Probably the best news in here is going back to the 2010 census, the quality assessment of the administrative records work. It was out of all the 50 million or so, I don't know why the columns didn't line up, but 50 million or so NRFU households, 10% were determined to be vacant, 5 million of those, so 15% determined to be occupied, a very small percentage determined to be non-existent, and there was lots of agreement with the actual NRFU field work going back to 2010, so this is really good news. The downside is that the administrative records didn't effectively determine 37 million of these households, so I thought to myself, well, can we do better than that? But 12.5 million of these addresses were determined, and most of them correctly. I looked up the Census of Canada has about 13 million households. So this was like taking out a whole Census of Canada out of the non-response fieldwork, which could be huge looking ahead to 2020. So, you look at it in one way, could be really impressive, and you can inch up that number, that would be even more impressive. Now, so the idea here is to decrease this number without making too many mistakes. Now, one of the interesting things you showed here is that your administrative record strategy was less frequent in determining vacancies or occupancies in neighborhoods with high % Hispanic. A little bit different among neighborhoods with high % Black. It was better with determining vacancies there. But one of my takeaways from this is going to be with the data involved in the inputs to this. Why did these administrative records perform less well in neighborhoods with high % Hispanic? And I'll get to the point about data again in just a moment. So looking ahead to 2018 and 2020, the additional second mailing that you're doing is going to be a great idea. I think to try to reduce those households where there was a vacancy and then an occupancy and so forth, the second mailing should be super effective in helping with that. Data-wise, though, I think your idea to go and try to use SNAP data, for example, is a really good one. And I wondered why, there's not that much time, but I wonder if other kinds of state data would be especially effective, again, trying to get at areas and among where in high % Hispanic neighborhoods, or I think about Texas and California, and the kind of state data that might be very helpful. Birth records, driver's licenses, state IDs. I try to find these kind of data in the Ad Health study that I'm working on at the state level. It's really hard, it's state by state, it's very difficult, and so forth. But maybe if we can focus on the biggest states with, you don't have to get Wyoming and South Dakota. Maybe you just go to those states where your population and your administrative records, where you need to use the records to better determine these addresses. That would be the best strategy, is to focus in on a few states rather than all of them. I'm not sure that can actually be done, but that's where I would do, is focus on the prize, and those few states would be the prize in this case. Okay, so My reaction to your current algorithm, that was one of your questions. I think the distance algorithm is well conceptualized. I think it should work well. The very important caveat being that the input data needs to be rich and detailed as possible, especially for the people and addresses most likely to be in NERFU. You got a selection issue here. And I think using the tax records and Medicare data it's great. It's probably the best you can use at the federal level, but that's not going to be the best data to get at the addresses that are the most likely to be non-respondents or non-existent and so forth. So that's where I think the creativity has to come in to use SNAP and other state data to the extent that you can in the right places to be able to do this work more effectively and to inch down that number of households that you need to visit 6 times or what have you. Another question I had is what are the best cut points for or thresholds for the vacant, non-existent, and occupied housing units? In those graphs, you kind of drew the cut points. I'm not sure how those were determined. I'm not sure if there's what kind of analysis you've done on sensitivity or specificity of those cut points. And I'm wondering if those cut points should be different across geographic areas too. If your model is working better in certain places than others. And so maybe that could be calibrated differently depending on the data that are used in different places. Now that would be hard to write up and hard to explain. But I think that could be really important to not take a one-size-fits-all approach in the use of these administrative records across places. So at the bottom here, say, the good data are going to be essential. I don't know what data to use. I threw a bunch of possibilities out there. I'm sure you've thought of these, but again, the selection issue is what's really important here. Medicare is not going to be the IRS stuff. I think that's helpful and you're going to get some good stuff there, but I think who you're trying to reach here in the addresses, the data has to be more creative. Okay, finally, the increase in contact strategy, like I said, is great, and together with your improved input data, the change could yield very important results in 2018. I would strongly recommend CSAC see these results as quickly as possible. In the fall meeting, if we could, they could, I won't be here anymore, but because there's not going to be much time to be able to do that afterwards. Finally, I want to say thanks to Tom and his team. This was the best experience I had working on CSAC with someone who sent the paper maybe a month ahead of time. This is a hard paper to get through. This is a very detailed, rich set of results and so forth. He sent his slides ahead of time. He wrote to me and said, let's talk about this. We went back and forth. He was very helpful in trying to get my slides right and so forth. So I thank him for that. That was, that has not always been the case. And this is so a wonderful experience of how that can best work in the case of the CSAC. So that's much appreciated.
Do you have responses, Tom?
I can just do a couple, and do you want to save time for the discussion? So with the characteristics, this could be something with a future meeting. We have done looking at the 2015 census test, the 2016 census test, with using administrative records, information to try to be able to assign characteristics. Andy Keller has done a lot of work on this, looking at the retrospective of 2010. So that is something that maybe might be able to be done before the 2018 census test if this group is looking to do that. And also with the cut points, you did mention that. And one of the nice things with us changing our strategy, especially on our vacant and our delete side, it's a little bit less sensitive to what cut points we do make. We might be able to even put our cut point a little bit lower to say, okay, we're going to say, the example had 10%. So we might be able to bump that up to 13%, because the only ones that don't end up getting field work are the ones that have both before and after, where before we were saying, okay, we're doing no field work just for these 10%. So with the change, it is long. I do appreciate you bringing up the idea of doing multiple cut point, using distant functions determined for different geographic areas. That is something that could be done. The results I showed was using one cut for everybody, so that does show that is a thing which we can end up doing. So those are some of the things which we definitely, and do thank you for your nice words and the comments that you do have.
Other questions, comments? Noel?
So thanks, Tom, and also to Bob too for a very illuminating session. Just wanted to bring up like a couple of technical points. I know at the basis of a lot of what you're doing is a multinomial distribution and logistic regression. So the estimates that you have of the probabilities are being treated sort of one estimate of it at a time. So p hat vacant, p hat occupied, p hat delete. In fact, they have a property that they might not necessarily sum to 1 because you have some unresolved cases, but the sum of them is always less than 1. And that particular property implies correlation between the p hats, and that correlation's not accounted for in what you're currently doing. So generally speaking, the correlation is minus pi pj divided by n, and the variances are different too. They're p1 minus p divided by n. And so what I'm getting at is if the true probability of being vacant is different from the true probability of being occupied, which you expect that to be the case, then p hat actually has different variability associated with it. The Euclidean distance that you use does not recognize that. And I noticed at the end of your presentation, Tom, you said, well, other suggestions, and that's what I'm doing. So the Euclidean distance is essentially a vector minus a target. And that the transpose of the vector minus the target times the vector minus the target. And what I'm suggesting is that you standardize that Euclidean distance and take the vector minus the target transpose and divide by the inverse of that covariance matrix that I just attempted to say in words. And in other words, let's call that sigma. So it's y minus target prime sigma inverse, y minus target. And that's, you know, a standardized statistic. It does mean that those contours that you have will be elliptical rather than circular, of the sort that you see. And because this is a bunch of probabilities which sum to 1 or strictly less than 1, the usual way that that is illustrated diagrammatically is using a simplex or a ternary diagram. And I noticed you use half a triangle. Now, this is a small thing, but if you present that at JSM, you might get somebody like me in the audience suggesting a ternary diagram or a simplex. And what that is, instead of being half a right-angled triangle, it turns out to be an equilateral triangle, and that's the usual way it's presented. So these are technical things. The final technical thing is I noticed that you were worried about errors in variables, errors in covariables, and the idea was to try to smooth some of those errors away. I think that's a good idea. You might not have the luxury to fit an EIV or an errors in variables model, but as part of your, I guess, testing, you could fit the errors in variables model. And what happens, of course, with errors in variables is that the slopes in the logistic regression that you fit are unbiased, yet if you ignore the errors in the variables, they become biased, and then your predictions are biased. So your strategy of upfront trying to smooth the covariates is trying to beat down that bias, but it might be good to see how bad the bias is and run a small simulation experiment by doing two things: beating down the bias by smoothing it, or fitting an errors in variables model and getting an unbiased estimate and an unbiased prediction. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you, and probably might end up following up more with you on some of your ideas, so thank you very much.
Allison.
Hi, Allison Plyer. So congratulations on this. I think it's something that a lot of us have been looking forward to and hungry for, and it's great to see that there's more in the works as well. And I think I really appreciated Bob's summary as well and his suggestions, which were, I thought, spot on and really helpful. So I would just add a couple thoughts. When I think about the state records and, the populations that you were indicating were a little bit harder to verify, the birth records, I think, would be the perhaps low-hanging fruit, right? Because I think the census has some access to those, and we know that birth rates are highest among Latino populations currently, so that might help identify some of those households. And then on the USPS data, we've done a lot of work with those delivery records, and and your work, of course, was much more massive, and it was interesting to hear and fun to hear you talking about getting the records at various points relative to essentially the census day. And it occurred to me in our work, and when we've talked actually with postal carriers, that you might want to consider them as part of your field operations, and maybe think of them as part of the partnership, right? So earlier we were asking what are we going to do about ensuring that populations like Latinos who might be more concerned about responding to the census, what are we going to do to reach out? And the director said, we'll make sure we're reaching out through our partners. I think the postal carriers, if they understood that the data they're collecting is going to be used in this way, and really were reached out to in that way, they would probably collect it a little bit more rigorously because their uses are a little different than your own.
Yes, I totally agree. Yesterday, we had a meeting with the United States Postal Service. I mean, we are doing these partnerships where we're talking about how can we use address information and also with assigning the undeliverable as addressed and the NICSI reason. So we will be working with their staff who does this out of their Memphis, Tennessee facilities with what things are we end up seeing? Because the nice thing is that we have multiple mailings, so we have multiple indications from them, but we can also contribute. What was the status of that? Was it vacant? Was it a non-existent address? So we can kind of go back and forth and say, what did we see? One of the things we did in the 2016 census test is we actually had a qualitative part where we actually did interactions with the United States Postal Service. We did focus groups of the carriers. We went to where the processing facilities were. Because with doing these things, they put VAC on a mail piece and they proceed to put it in a bin. Now, we wanted to ride around in the mail trucks, but unfortunately, with lawyers involved, my staff wasn't able to drive around in the mail trucks while the postal carriers were doing it, but we were able to talk to them before and afterwards and have this qualitative information as well to say, going forward in 2018 and 2020, how can we work together to just do the things you were saying? With birth records, one thing which we're able to get along those lines is the CARA KidLink file, because through Social Security Administration and their applications, we get quarterly deliveries of those. So we do have that information. The only thing is it does link the children potentially with the parents. We've generally been able to link to the mother and father 66% of the time, only the mother about 20% of the time, and then only the father about 4% of the time. Unfortunately, this information doesn't have address information, so we can't put them at a particular housing unit, but that is some information which we are currently getting related to birth information that we're already getting from Social Security. And one thing which I forgot to mention earlier, which I would, is with the 2010 analysis, which we did do with that 7.5 million, that 15% that we had as administrative records vacant, or sorry, administrative records occupied. I would like to say for the 2016 census test, there was only 65% of the time that we had to use that administrative records occupied determination. For 35% of the other cases, we were able to get some other response. They were able to complete the field work, go online. So for 35% of the cases, we were able to get results that we didn't have to use the administrative records information. So that's one thing which I forgot to bring up earlier, which I did want to end up saying. And in these tests, I mean, Lisa mentioned in the brains, Tim is DeBron. But we didn't have from communications, we did not have our megaphone saying, hey, the census is going on. So with having that as well could impact that. Because we did end up seeing that 8% of the people did respond after we did that additional mailing.
Andrew?
Andrew Samwick. Yeah, I just wanted to echo the sentiment that I think this is some of the most important work that we're going to be able to give input on. And I just want to echo some of the earlier comments. In choosing which partners you use for something as complicated as this, I think you have to pay attention to partners that have the same interests as you do, which means getting the name of the person and the location of the person, both of them, right. And so, I don't mean to impugn anyone's motives. Everybody's too busy, got too much work to do. But that's not the Postal Service. I mean, they get paid when the parcel is put in the mail, not when it gets delivered, right? And so, like, the top line of the address, the name, is kind of a nuisance parameter, right? And so they do heroic work, but they don't sort of have the interest in getting you aligned with the name and the location. The IRS, sure, it's helpful to know the address of the person, but they want to align the identification number, the Social Security number, with the flows of money. The location of the person is incidental to them, right? But now you think about some of the places that Bob mentioned, and states, so driver's licenses. I think that has to be one of the best sources of data to mine, because for states, the issue is about representation, and in other cases, funding for transfer programs that are sort of funded by the federal government but implemented by the states. So the states should care about getting people in the right place. And so I would think that that has to be an important area of data to mine. And, I'll sound like a broken record, but utility companies, they make money if they can identify people in a location, right? They have to know whether a unit is vacant or occupied, because the minimal thing that happens, other than people walking in and out the door, is that there's power going to it. So this is not a criticism of the work that's been done. It's just a plea for, in the next round of work, focus on some of the partners that really are just as invested as you are in matching people to locations. Thanks.
Yep, thank you for those comments. So one thing with we mail to the address, and that's one thing with the Postal Service. We are paying. There are partners, but we are also paying for a service. We are paying for them to do the NICSE service. So one thing which we've learned is that they were assigning codes that don't necessarily apply to when you are mailing to a particular address. So one of the things we're looking is at having 10, 11 codes, like for census processing, kind of similar to what we do with our interviewers. Do we want to narrow down the number of codes that they might be able to use? So there are things which we're looking to be able to do. Thank you for the suggestion about driver's license. We can look at that. We at least was seeing a similar thing. We've looked at IRS 1099 returns, and seeing that because you say mailing to where you work, where you need to get your W-2 form. And one thing, we've seen a little bit of lag of that. You may have left your job, and so you didn't tell your former employer, and so they mailed your W-2 to a former address. And so we can look at driver's license, but there also is the potential, especially for us trying to identify vacant and vacant addresses, that you can still drive your car after moving. So how much can that end up catching up? The utility companies we can look at, the challenge is there. There is 3,000 companies across the whole entire country. So is there states, does the state end up keeping that? Because if the state ends up giving it to us and they say, hey, we think it's vacant, then it's, hey, state, we are using your information to say, hey, the population count here is 0. So there's definitely lots of things which you can also, all these solutions may not be a part of 2020, which things might be able to do in 2030 as well. So thank you.
Other comments? Bob.
And Bob Hummer, just to reiterate again, I mentioned this already, but I don't think these things have to be for every state. I think driver's licenses, ID cards, utility companies in California, Texas, New York, and Florida would go a long way.
Jack?
Yeah, Jack Dangerman. This really argues for a national address database which is transactionally maintained and openly accessible with a geocode and address. I mean, my sense of this, it would save hundreds of millions of dollars, both within federal government as well as state and local. Adding to that, what organization in our country should be in control of this database? Should it be the post office? Should it be the IRS? Should it be HUD? There's only one. It's the Census Bureau. So I don't know how to articulate this, but I just think there's this lurking, there's a demand and something that ought to be done. And don't you think you should do this, Tom? I mean, you could stand up and do this and solve all the problems because you have the know-how to do it. And also, by the way, I'm interested to ask you another question, which is what is the IT infrastructure that you're carrying this out within or imagine it to be carried out within?
Yeah, because we are, as part of the results we're showing now, it was part of the work was done by my team in a research environment. So we are now proceeding for the 2018 census test. These functionalities, which were done by my team, are now being allocated to the PARASYS group, which is doing some administrative records processing, and then also the CASE group, which Michael was talking about earlier, taking advantage of their processing to be able to do the functionality which we were doing for the previous tests. Those two systems are going to be doing it. For your other questions, for that, I'm going to defer to Lisa.
So I'll just say, Jack, in terms of the national address database, thank you. Thank you very much. We're also very interested in a national address database, and this is something that, in an exploratory way, we've been working with other agencies to figure out the best way to move forward in. Specifically, we've been working very closely over the last few years, I believe, with the Department of Transportation and others. We appreciate your support and your thoughts on that. I think we agree that a national address database would be an excellent thing.
But how do we move it forward beyond just, okay, it's an intellectually interesting idea?
I think Deirdre's going to, yeah.
I mean, because this argues for, this efficiency is really behind this. Efficiency, making government better, making America great, all of these things,
I thank you for that. Deirdre's going to explain a little bit about our progress and where we are with.
Hi, Jack. We've been working with the Federal Geographic Data Committee. They recently, just today, the Executive Steering Committee approved the new definition of an address theme. The National Spatial Data Infrastructure, the National Geospatial Data Assets, the addresses has not been a theme. We've had a theme for boundaries, a theme for roads. We now have a theme for addresses. We have really spearheaded working with the FGDC and other members of the federal and state and local governments to come up with that definition. So it was really great that that definition was approved today. As part of the development of the address theme, we are working to develop a national address database. And we have been designated along with the Department of Transportation, not only to lead the theme forward, but the national address database. The Department of Transportation has been hosting an environment in which states have been contributing their data as a pilot project. We cannot house that data here because of Title 13 restrictions, but we're helping move the ball along. We have several staff members who are dedicated to this effort. So I hope that's helpful. Okay.
Does that mean that you can't ever do it? Does that mean that because of Title 13, the Bureau could never really be the host for the address database?
Here at the facility within our servers, yes, that's what it means under Title 13. But, we're willing to help provide expertise. We have managed a national address database for decades, right? And so we know how to do it, how to ingest the data, how to maintain the data. We're willing to provide that support.
But that still doesn't get us out of this catch-22 situation because you know how to do it, but you can't do it.
And so I think it's safe for me to say that in order for us to be effective in this endeavor, we have to be able to stand up an infrastructure. And by we, I mean the people participating in this effort. And we have to have the funding to make that happen. We don't have that now.
Well, the infrastructure could be the cloud, and so it gets it outside of the building. The funding could be brought about by a consortium, like, I don't believe in enterprise systems being built by passing the cup. That doesn't really happen. But you could certainly build a constituency, both within the government and also beyond the government. I mean, let me just give you some guidance. In the 3DEP program by USGS, I believe they either did it in-house or they hired a consultant, but they defined how much money 3DEP, and for those of you who don't know what 3DEP is, it's the 3D LiDAR measurement of terrain as a theme. They showed that it would save hundreds of millions of dollars if they invested $100 million in 3DEP. And it's true, so they've gotten really substantial congressional support because they were able to do the fundamental work, the cost-benefit work. They published it, they advocated it, and drove it home. And it's like they're now looking at $75 million more this year. My God, that's amazing. So I just urge that not only, somebody in the government, and I don't think it's going to happen out of the FGDC. It has to be an agency, frankly, that could take it on and do those definitive studies. And once it's defined and part of the study, it would be the benefit to the private sector. Because, organizations like Jack, you would love to have a national database, and 5,000 other organizations in the private sector. So there could be a huge effort to both reduce costs in the federal government by doing this, but also build a constituency around it.
Yeah, and this is Jack Levis, and you threw out a number, Jack, on a couple $100 million a year. It's worth way more than that. Trust me, we're developing our own, and knowing whether an address exists, doesn't exist, is it valid but inaccurate, just for UPS alone, there's savings. It's got to be for the whole country and everybody too.
Yeah, and one of the basic theories of database is no redundancy or minimum redundancy. And that's sort of impossible for something as grand as this, except that we now have a new platform, web services with distributed computing, that could do it. So, all the technical barriers are gone. All of the cost justifications are there. We just need leadership to be able to pull this off. And so I look forward to the geography department really driving this home. Never mind.
I appreciate your support, and I'd like to talk further to hear more guidance. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
This was fabulous. Tom and Deirdre, this was just wonderful, and I think all the comments of the group were very good. Now we're moving on to the next thing, which is kind of experimental. We're going to try to have the basis of developing our comments and recommendations on the four things today. The discussant of each, and I'll say of each thing, will organize it. And Andrew had kindly, before the meeting, I asked him and he said yes. There was no discussant for the working lunch, but I asked Andrew to be the organizer of the comments. What we're going to do is what we did last time, which I am told is totally legal, folks, is that the Sunshine is the discussant and in charge of organizing the comments on the 2020 census update, Andrew on the working lunch, Juan Pablo on adaptive design, and Bob Hummer on algorithms for administrative data. People interested in each of those themes gather around the given person, and the organizer organize what you're doing. Have your stuff in order as well as you can. You can send me more stuff. Have what you can in order by 4:30, no later. And then email it to csacchair@gmail.com. And I am told this can all work, and I can get it in and make sure I can get what you send me before we have to leave at 5 o'clock. If this is wrong, IT people tell me, before 5 o'clock. And then if I know how to get the stuff off of CSAC chair email address, others of you can send me comments even later. But if I can make sure that the system works and we mostly get done with the topics for today, mainly, by the end of today, that would be fabulous. Is that okay? So you can stand up and stretch and all that, and then distribute yourselves related to whatever, and you can move around between people, about whatever you'd like to put input on. And my brave organizers, of course, you'll do the best you can to make this coherent and integrated and all that kind of great stuff. So, what?
The comments that you want sent to you should be integrated by the group leader?
Yes.
Okay.
But if you have other comments, second thoughts, additional thoughts, you can also send me those. But I'd like the group leader to organize the comments on the theme or topic or whatever as well as possible. Yeah, Bob?
Okay, are these suggestions for future work or just?
Any of the above. My plan is, I'll take these, we'll get the things on the rest of them tomorrow, and I think we have enough time tomorrow to do what we did last time. We have it put together, we put it up, we edit, we go through, we talk until we're happy in terms of what suggestions and what's recommendations and such. Is that okay, Bob? And last time we had time to go through it 2 or 3 times till everyone was satisfied, and I hope it works like that this time. Does that sound okay? Yes?
Ken Simonson, how do you want to deal with recommendations of the big data working group, since those won't be presented to the full
Well,
committee until tomorrow
it seems to me, you tell me if I'm wrong, for the big data working group and the other working group, if there also are other themes tomorrow talked about and such. So I think that the presenter of each of those could organize whatever comes out of that, because you're not like a census presenter. Is that okay? Have I answered all the questions you think of this moment? So then distribute yourselves and go to it, gang.